I forgot my ABT mug. I may have to take a break halfway through and go get it. A crucial prop. Welcome everybody to this, I think is the 9th round we've done of this wonderful episode with my spectacular co-host in Melbourne, Australia. Jen, how is everything at 8 o'clock in the morning in Melbourne?
Good morning, Randy. Well, it was good until my normal computer died about 3 minutes ago, as you saw, and I hastily grabbed a laptop and attempted to plug in my microphone and get my life sorted. So that's Thursday morning coming at you from Australia.
All right, but you're with us live on YouTube, and the show is ready to roll. Let's see, and we've got two wonderful guests today, but we're not going to get to them for about 15 minutes. So you guys can, Jennifer and John, you can mute audio and video because I'm going to go through a little introduction here. And today is a special episode focusing on the documentary feature film on Netflix for the last few months called Seaspiracy, about ocean conservation issues, which I've had quite a few years of involvement with. So I have to give a bit of a background setup context for all that we're going to be talking about here. And by the way, how much fun did you have last week with our episode that had 6 guests all at once after the Blitz?
It just reminded me how boring you and I are, Randy, and about the fact that we should invite friends more often. But, you know, very particular friends. They were excellent friends to invite.
Well, the subtitle of the podcast is "You Don't Ever Have to Be Boring." So that's what we did. We resorted to friends to keep us from being so boring. Well done. It shows we're experts in unboringness. And let's hope that this intro doesn't bore anybody, because got to set up, as we know, this podcast is, we're not going to talk about fish species specifically or types of plastic pollution, things like that. We'll be talking about the communication of ocean conservation through this movie, in particular, Seaspiracy. And this podcast is all about the ABT narrative template, ABT framework. And so we'll be looking at things in that, from that perspective. So what I want to begin with here are 3 basic points about ocean conservation in general. The points are reality, perception, and communication. And what ocean conservation is about basically is the human destruction of the ocean. And when you look at that, it kind of breaks into 2 major topics, which is pollution and overfishing. So there are lots of other things we do to the ocean, but those are the 2 big ones. And so let's start with reality. The reality is overfishing is much worse than pollution, both in space and time. It goes back a long time in terms of time, and it reaches all through the oceans. Fishing fleets go out there in the middle of the ocean and have an impact everywhere. Here's a couple little anecdotes just to kind of get us going and picturing what I'm talking about with the time and space. Let's start with the logs of Christopher Columbus. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and showed up in the Caribbean, a bunch of these islands. And in his logs, historians have found accounts where they talk about coming into bays and seeing an entire beach that was black, basically. And as they got closer, they realized it was black from the shells of living turtles all hauled out on the beach. That's how abundant sea turtles were once upon a time in the Caribbean. The crewmen complained about it at night, the knocking against the hull of the ship. The turtles were so abundant, they were bouncing up against the ship hulls, the wooden ships. And today you go to those same bays and you'd be lucky to see 1 sea turtle in a day or 2 or 3 days. They've been just massively fished out over the years. A similar anecdote, 30 years ago, I was on a cruise around Spitsbergen and Svalbard, north of Norway. And on board, we had a marine mammal biologist, and he gave us kind of a 500-year-old tour of the bays around there, in which we would pull in these areas. And he would say, if we were here 500 years ago, you'd be looking at hundreds of thousands of walrus and seals and narwhals and all of these things. In our cruise there, we were lucky one day we found one place where about 25 walruses were hauled out, and that's all that we saw. So again, this enormous amount of biomass of marine mammals, all long gone, heavily fished out all around the world. So that's what I say, both in time, going back hundreds of years, and in space, all the way out to the middle of the oceans. And this impact of humans on the oceans kind of just falls into those 2 categories. It also can be thought of in simple terms as what we've taken out versus what we put in. Overfishing is what we've taken out. Pollution is what we've put in. That then leads to the second topic, which is perception. And about 20 years ago, I started a project called the Shifting Baselines Ocean Media Campaign. And in the beginning, sort of out of due diligence, I spent a lot of time talking to ocean conservationists, trying to get the lay of the land. And one conversation I remember very clearly was a guy, I think from the New York Aquarium, who told me about a big survey they did of survey of American attitudes towards the oceans. And what they hit people with was a simple question of which do you think is more important of the two, pollution or overfishing? And I asked Jen that question yesterday. What did she think the bulk of the answers were? What did people say? And what was your answer, Jen?
I was absolutely certain it would be pollution, that's what people would connect with.
And you're correct about that. And then by a little bit or by a lot?
No, by a ton.
A ton. Yeah, basically, roughly a ton. About 80-20, as I recall. So that's what you get with the general public. You ask them what's going on with the oceans. What are you more worried about? Everybody connects with pollution. And that then leads to the third topic, which is communication. So what you find is that pollution is a very visceral topic. It is very visual. As a result, it goes right to your gut. There's all the imagery of all the things that we've thrown in there, oil spills and plastics and things like that. And the results, the dead creatures washing up, having been poisoned. And just poison, the concept by itself is very visceral and generates fear in people. Overfishing ends up being much more cerebral. You kind of have to put the pieces together, like I said, of doing these imaginary cruises of here's what it used to look like here. But you go to a lot of those places and they look beautiful today. It's just a question of your definition of beauty, whether that includes lots of creatures or not. And in fact, that's sort of the topic that really connected me 20 years ago, was this topic of shifting baselines. And I'm going to tell about in a few minutes and use that as a means to introduce our two guests. So what we're here to discuss is this documentary Seaspiracy, and came out about 2 months ago or so. When it came out, several of my ocean conservation friends contacted me and said, "What'd you think? You're a filmmaker." So I watched it, and the film it basically has two ABTs. So it's about a young British guy, filmmaker. And if you're first time to this podcast, the ABT is the narrative template of and, but, therefore, that really kind of gets to the core of whatever story is being told. So his two ABTs that he told were basically, the first one was the ABT of his awakening, more or less. He tells about how he was a young kid and he fell in love with the oceans and he watched all these documentaries and they were all wonderful. But one day he began to find out that, wait a second, the oceans aren't as healthy as what I was seeing on TV. Turns out they're in trouble. There's all these environmental problems. Therefore, he decided to commit himself to getting involved with ocean conservation. So that's really straightforward ABT that kind of leads us into his personal journey in the film. Then from there, the overall ABT of what the movie is about how once he got involved with ocean conservation, he began to get bombarded with the issue of plastics. And there were commercials and campaigns everywhere about plastics are ruining the oceans. And he got the impression, which is easy to do, which is that plastics and pollution was the main issue. But think back to what we said, overfishing really is the really serious large-scale issues that's devastated entire ecosystems. Pollution, and plastic pollution in particular, tends to be more along coastlines, and it's more of just the past century. So he finally got to the point where he began to learn more about overfishing, and that's sort of the but there. But I began to realize, wait a second, there's this overfishing issue, which is much larger, and therefore he felt duped, like he'd been misled in the whole deal. Therein lies the title of the film, Seaspiracy, basically mixing sea with conspiracy. And it's presented in sort of a conspiratorial tone to some extent at the expense of some people that we'll talk about. But that's really the basic overall ABT, which is that the bigger issue is overfishing and we haven't done enough. And as a matter of fact, one of our two guests, Jennifer, a couple months ago, when she and I first talked about it, I hadn't heard of the film, and I asked her what she thought. And she said, it's about the same old thing that was going on 20 years ago, how we really haven't made much progress. So we'll talk about that. Now I want to lay down the groundwork to introduce the two guests and kind of put them into context, which is in 2000. Well, actually, this starts in 1995. Legendary fisheries biologist Daniel Pauly published a paper in 1995 in the fisheries world and coined this term shifting baselines. And what it refers to is a baseline as a reference point from the past. If we begin to lose track of these reference points, if we begin to forget what nature looked like in the past, then how can we ever restore nature if we're looking at things today and thinking, well, that's about as good as it ever was? And this happens a lot. Historians come along, they reach back in the past and point out those things I was saying there about the turtles and the marine mammals and on and on. Fish stocks used to be much more abundant. So it's the syndrome of shifting baselines where you just don't know what used to be there and you make that mistake. It's a very important concept, but it pretty much sat in the scientific literature for 5 or 6 years. Then in 2001, my good buddy Jeremy Jackson, coral reef ecologist, published a paper that was on the cover of Science. It was an enormously important paper, had 18 co-authors. And what that paper was about was that we can't understand the problems that are happening in coastal ecosystems today that are all collapsing and falling apart unless we know their history, unless we reach back a few hundred years and know what was there to begin with and what we've lost. So the same basic thing, shifting baselines. And as he began to get, that paper of his was covered in over 1,000 newspapers, media outlets all around the world. It really had a huge impact and kind of was a milestone in the whole topic of historical ecology. Then he contacted me, and I'd been out of film school for a couple of years and developed some resources in Hollywood. And he said, don't you think this term shifting baselines is much more general than just ocean conservation? Don't you think it applies to everything in our life and our society? It's the lowering of standards. And I got it. And so I ended up writing an editorial, sending it to the Los Angeles Times. And the editors there so connected with the term shifting baselines that they basically did me a big favor and rewrote the whole damn thing, put in their own examples, made it better, bigger, broader, and got it out there. And it reached a huge audience. It was reprinted in, probably 200 different blogs and magazines and things like that. And it was in 3 college textbooks. And it's been cited a lot over the years. Just in the past couple of years, a number of people have come. There's been a building literature around shifting baselines. And last year in Nature, there was a review paper on shifting baselines on coral reefs, in which they actually cited that editorial as one of the starting points for the whole awareness of this topic of shifting baselines. So as soon as that came out, then Jeremy and I set to work making this whole mass media campaign, and also Stephen Miller, who's been part of our ABT framework course. The 3 of us put it together and I made short, humorous PSAs in Hollywood to try and create a likable voice around the issue of shifting baselines. And I tried to put together a coalition of 20 some environmental groups. And about that time, around 2004, was contacted by our first of our 2 guests, John Hocevar, who had just gone to work with Greenpeace. And one of the first things he did when he got there, he's a fisheries expert, and learned about shifting baselines. The campaign we were running got in touch and said, can we join the group? And they did. And he and I ended up doing one small PSA campaign a couple of years later. And so he's a wonderful resource on fisheries. And actually, I introduced him to, we were just talking about this a few minutes ago, to our other guest, Jennifer Jacquet. So in 2005, I was asked by Patagonia to write a little thing about shifting baselines for their catalog. And I wrote this short essay explaining what shifting baselines is, why it's important. And a couple of weeks after it came out, I got this cranky email from this graduate student of Daniel Pauly's at University of British Columbia. And she said, nice little essay there about shifting baselines, but you didn't mention Daniel Pauly, the guy who coined the term. And I wrote back to her, and I think I even sent her the first draft of that article that did have a paragraph talking about him, but the editor cut that out. And I did point out that if you look at my 2002 editorial in the LA Times, about the 3rd paragraph, I cite Daniel Pauly. So it's not like I was trying to ignore him. Then I demanded a phone call. We got on the phone instantly, heard this incredibly smart person talking about the issue, and then realized, wait a second, as soon as we hung up, I called Jeremy Jackson and said, you need to grab some money and fly her down to Scripps Institute of Oceanography, have her give a talk, which she did about 2 weeks later and blew everybody away. It was a tremendous talk. She's a great, great speaker. She and Jeremy instantly began going to work on a lot of this fisheries issue stuff. And she can set the details straight on this, but around 2006 or 7, she published a super important paper in Nature. So important that Nature that year chose, and Nature, of course, the most important publication in the science world. And they chose it as, I think, one of their top 5 most important papers of the year. And she teamed up with Jeremy. She was the lead author, Jeremy and Daniel Pauly and a couple of other legendary fisheries biologists. And the essence of it was, and again, she can correct this if I get it wrong, but basically the Marine Stewardship Council, which are mentioned in this film, Seaspiracy, were suddenly handing out their sustainability logo, their kind of seal of approval, to a whole bunch of different fish species. And then what she discovered was, wait a second, they're being supported by Walmart, and those are the species that Walmart sells. And the paper was basically an expose on some crooked hijinks going on in the world of fisheries biology. And was, I think, fairly controversial. She went on from there to do lots of other work. She published a really popular book in around 2013 about shame, new uses for an old, whatever it is, old resource. And she's become an expert on shame and lots of other things like that. And so that's probably enough introduction for everybody on that note. Let's have the two of you join us. I've got one question to get us started with, but Jennifer and John, are you there? Yay. There's John and there is Jennifer. Jennifer, where are you coming to us from?
My parents' house in Ohio, actually, a state without oceans. So where it all began.
So you're safe there.
I am safe.
Nice. And John, you are coming to us from your backyard. Where?
Yep, this is the Backyard Tiki Bar in Washington, D.C.
Excellent. And you're still working with Greenpeace?
Still working for Greenpeace. I've been leading the oceans work for Greenpeace USA for almost 18 years, if you can believe it.
Amazing. And Jennifer, still stuck at NYU. Are you going
very happy
back
at NYU, and I've been there since 2012. I went there I moved there from UBC, as you mentioned. So
Wonderful.
In the Big Apple.
Okay. Excellent. Well, and you endured the pandemic there and everything else. Okay. So first simple little question to just get the ball rolling here. This feature film, and by the way, one of the things we're going to do a sidebar on eventually is Jen just got through watching the film, My Octopus Teacher. And a couple months ago when all these ocean folks got in touch with me about Seaspiracy, they were all wound up and said, oh my God, this thing is going to change everybody's attitudes. My first instinct was to kind of ground truth things. And I sent an email to the problem with Netflix is they don't put out metrics on how big an audience these films reach. So I sent an email to one of my film school classmates who's a big cheese with director, producer with HBO and Netflix, and just asked him, what do you know? How important was this film? And he wrote back immediately and said, here's what I know is the film, My Octopus Teacher, people are still talking about in a big, big way. And Seaspiracy, whatever that was, it came and went overnight. So he knew next to nothing about it. He hadn't seen it and there was just no buzz about it. And, there you go. I think that's not a number, but I think it's a fairly reliable, and several of my other filmmaker friends have kind of corroborated the same thing. So as a result, in a bit, we're going to have Jen talk a little bit about those two films side by side as exercises in communication about the oceans. But the first simple question I want to put to both of you, start with Jennifer, on a continuum from disastrously bad to sadly accurate, where would you place the message, the content of Seaspiracy?
I'm afraid that like every piece of content that you watch, the more you know about a subject, the more disappointing that content is. So of course, Seaspiracy had its flaws, and you and I discussed a number of those, and we've seen those all over social media or at least my social media. But for all of its flaws, I think it did something really special and important and different. And that is to see seafood as animals and have this approach to them that maybe we shouldn't be eating them at all, and sort of wrest the narrative away from traditional fisheries science narrative and lens of seeing the oceans. And to me, that was really important and almost predictable in what we might expect in the conversation.
Okay, great. And I'm going to get to John in a minute, but Jen, I laid out the basic ABT of what it's about. And I think in alignment with what Jennifer just said, which is that the therefore of the movie was therefore overfishing is the big issue. And it's time for us to really make a difference by just stop eating a lot of this sort of stuff. Is that kind of the message you got from the whole film?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is, for all its flaws from a communication point of view that no doubt we'll talk about, I think the message is absolutely clear that if you do care about the oceans, the simplest thing you as an individual can do is to stop eating fish.
Yeah. And Jen, does that match what your take was on the film?
Well, I mean,
Jennifer. I gotta keep saying Jen and Jennifer. Right. Danger. Okay.
I mean, what I'm surprised you didn't bring up in the introduction was that you and I had a blog together for ages, the Shipping Baselines blog, and our very first debate was about whether or not you should eat seafood. And I argued no, and you argued yes. And I remember that, that Daniel Pauly at the time told me, if you argue that you should not eat seafood, you will be placing yourself outside of the conversation. And I remember mentioning that in the blog post. And now here we are. The conversation actually includes that argument quite clearly and strongly. And that's how the world is changing.
Yeah, let me add the little personal details on that debate that we had that Jennifer and I were co-bloggers for a short while there around 2009 or so. And we decided to open it. It was on science blogs. They had 100 scientist bloggers. And we decided to open it. It was called Shifting Baselines, and open it with this staged debate of she and I squaring off over this issue. Should we even eat fish? And she took the yes, we should, or the no, whatever, we should stop eating fish. And then I took the, albeit kind of contrived extreme other view, because at that point I wasn't eating non-sustainable things, at least. And I was definitely cutting back and ending consumption of certain things. In fact, there's great irony in this. I quit eating shrimp because Carl Safina was at our Hollywood Ocean Night and told me all these shrimp are now being farmed in Indonesia and they're full of metals and toxins. So why would you eat these horrible things? So he's the one that put me off on that. And then I wrote this kind of extreme other argument where I said, I'm not stopping eating any seafood until there's some giant boycotts argued. No sooner do we post it than Carl Safina teed off on me and gave me a whole lecture in the comment section about, I'm disgusted with you, Randy. How dare you? Blah, blah, blah. And I had to write to him. I said, I'm just play acting a character for the sake of debate. That's not what I think. And I say all that because next week we're going to do a whole episode on teaching. And I'm trying to get one person in our group to do the same thing, to write this extreme statement about teaching the ABT. And she's kind of pushing back on that. But anyhow, that's how you make for good learning experiences. Begin with a debate, the two ends of the spectrum like that. So, okay, getting back to this film, Seaspiracy, John, same question for you. On the continuum from one end of disastrously bad to the other end sadly accurate, where would you place the film itself?
It's a simple question that we could talk about all day. I don't think that it was a disaster. I guess at the end of the day, I'm glad that it was made. Part of the strength is also the weakness. It really did aim at getting people to stop eating fish, and that won't get us very far unless you're incredibly good at reaching and convincing people. It did reach a lot of people, and I think that surprised and impressed many of us enough that there was kind of a cultural conversation about that, at least in the US and some other places, and that's powerful and important. I think it was a missed opportunity to make that the main takeaway, because that won't save the ocean. That won't end overfishing. If the people that watch this film stop eating seafood, that doesn't get us far enough. So I like that also in the film, it talked about a couple other solutions, which start to get at the root causes and the systemic answers, like creating a network that's puzzle.
That was awesome.
Puzzle's in the middle of a war with two mockingbirds, and they're tormenting her. It's pretty insane. Anyway, other solutions that the film proposed were a network of protected areas, which is absolutely necessary.
Oh, wait, hang on that note, network of protected areas. Liz, this is your big moment. I'm wearing special my Marine Reserve t-shirt from Hawaii. Liz, you can just do the audio. Tell us about it and pronounce it for us.
It's Papa Hanau Moku Akea, and it's a marine national monument that was expanded to become the largest marine national monument in the world in 2016 by Obama, and it just celebrated the 15th anniversary. So you're welcome.
Oh wait, now does the name rhyme with Obama?
Good one.
Say it for us once more.
Papa Hanau Moku Akea.
Oh, okay.
And it relates to the Hawaiian genealogy.
Okay, the Obama Hana is in the middle of it. Okay, cool. Sorry about that, John. We can.
That's all right. It's a great shirt. Great. Totally with you on expanding it. And the other solution that the film put forward that I picked up anyway was ending harmful subsidies for commercial fisheries. Right there with them on that. There are a lot of things that were pretty unfortunate, and I'm not talking about the things that the nerdy condescending fisheries biologists got all animated about. I'm talking about, the gotcha moments aimed at embarrassing people that are actually doing really good work. And the whole "my issue is more important than your issue" thing, we all lose if that's the approach to this stuff. So
Okay, so then overall, simple yes or no, do you think this film helped out the anti-environmental folks?
I'm glad it was made.
Jennifer, same question. Oh, you're on mute.
I don't think it helped the anti-environmental folks. I think what it did, again, is get the bristles up and the guard up of traditional fisheries biologists. I mean, if you're just talking about the facts, I think that's what happened. Then there's a whole bunch of other things, like John mentioned, style-wise, choices that were made that nobody's quite comfortable with. But in terms of the facts, you see fisheries biologists really trying to take back this conversation. And I think it's expanding it into people who do care about animals or care about consumption patterns. And it's a new, trying to forge a new relationship, I think, with these animals that hasn't been done in any other ocean documentary. And it certainly wasn't done in my Octopus Teacher, for all the strengths of that film.
Okay. I hope I'm allowed to push back on you two, even though you're my guests. I think I've known you both for more than 15 years. Hopefully that goes beyond a threshold that gives me the the right to push back and disagree with you and not have you hate me more than normal. But I'll take exception to what both of you said there, which is I think that this really overall is a bonus to the anti-environmental folks. Just last night, and I think it was last night, maybe the night before, Jon Stewart was on Stephen Colbert and just saying horrible things about the Wuhan flu being developed in a lab in Wuhan. And Stephen Colbert was sitting there trying to take exception to him and trying to poke holes in it. It ends with him saying, and when did you get on the payroll of Senator McCarthy or Johnson, I think? I couldn't believe the things that Jon Stewart was saying. And then the headline on the Dredge Report was "Conservatives applaud Jon Stewart for a performance on the Wuhan lab thing on Colbert Report." This stuff becomes noise when you're getting all this skepticism around an important issue. And that's what this film, bottom line, is, in my assessment, to the outer circle. Now, this is what we talk a lot about in the ABT framework, is this simple little diagram of two concentric circles, the inner circle and the outer circle. To me, this film spoke only to the inner circle. It was controversial among them. To the outer circle, the only message that came across is, look at those environmentalists, all just cheating each other and ripping each other off and mismessaging about, they're just a big mess, as we've been trying to tell you. I put it in the same basket with the Jon Stewart thing, which really helps the people that are trying to attack the biomedical voices of authority, the epidemiologists. Suddenly he's lending all of his broad popularity to that voice. These things at the biggest and broadest of scales, most of the general public, that outer circle, does not parse into these films all these subtle details of this issue versus that. The main thing that they came away from that film was the second half of the title, Seaspiracy. There's something going on with these people ripping each other off over environmental issues. So that was my take on it. Now let's bring in the the decider, Jen. What is your take, bottom line, on the film, on that little spectrum from awfully bad to sadly true?
Look, I don't think I'm really authorized to be the decider here, but for me, the big takeaway was simply how much do I remember these two movies, and how much do they stay with me, and how much am I going to think about them in future, and how much am I going to want to, get my kids to watch them. And the thing I struggled with Seaspiracy, I mean, it was shocking, and I learned a lot, and it made me think a lot. But at the end of the day, I just came away feeling thoroughly overwhelmed, which was perhaps the point. And I recognize that might be the point. But 1 minute it was dolphins, then it was sharks, then it was marine certification, then it was turtles, then it was climate change, then it was mangroves, then it was slavery at sea, then it was whales. And I get that all of those things are real, and I get that I need to care about all of those things. But I just came away just overwhelmed and completely disempowered, and just feeling like, well, it's just all terrible. And I would probably, use an expletive if I didn't think I should be more polite. It's just all awful. And I guess if I then think about my Octopus Teacher, which I know we'll talk about more later, I fully recognize that I didn't learn the same amount, and it's a totally different genre. And, in some ways comparing them is not that fair because they're trying to do really different things for different audiences. But if we think about narratives and how narratives connect with people and narratives can lead people to feel differently and think differently and want to do something differently, then we have to ask ourselves, which of those two movies is more likely to lead people to want to do something different in terms of conserving and protecting the ocean? And yeah, my argument would be against Seaspiracy there.
Well, I will dig in deeper here because I think these two films are completely appropriate to compare them side by side. And I'm the designated cretin in this discussion. And I went to film school 27 years ago, leaving my academic position with the belief that I had developed from many books, but mostly from Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is that film is first and foremost an entertainment medium. It is not an educational medium. It is not an informational medium. It's a mess when people think that they're educating the public by presenting factual arguments in this medium of film. Michael Moore understood that in the late 90s. He was one guy who realized I'd better make these things entertaining if I want to reach anywhere outside the inner circle. And he's done, a fairly good job of that over the years. In fact, the very best job for, documentaries. You look at his Fahrenheit movie that, set box office records and things like that. He's understood the constraints of the medium. And these heavily educated people who somehow naively believe if we put together the facts enough, we can convince the public. That's what I got subjected to with my movie Flock of Dodos. Some of the top scientists watched it, and said they found it completely disappointing. We had hoped he would go for the jugular of the intelligent design movement, as though there existed some jugular that if you put your facts together the right way, you would instantly slit it and they would just collapse on the floor and you'd win this thing in an instant. It ain't that simple. Film is a visceral medium. It's not intellectual. And when you put together these informational things, you only reach this tiny little inner circle. They get all wound up about it. And by the way, in that fine tradition, for both of you, how many of these overfishing documentaries have there been? End of the line and empty oceans and what else that nobody ever watched? John, Jennifer?
A lot of people watch this one. And
yeah,
your comment about the outer circle, I think that's who this was for. It wasn't for the fisheries biologists. The fisheries biologists got mad and said stuff about how wrong it was. The outer circle never heard those reactions. All this, intense conversation and analysis that we're having, that didn't reach the outer circle. All they got was, wow, things are much worse out there in the ocean than I thought. And I think I'm going to think a little bit differently about seafood. The Octopus Teacher, my Octopus Teacher, I really liked for different reasons, very different film. I think other than really specifically, do I still want to eat octopus? Where Seaspiracy really made people think differently about their behaviors. I'm not sure that was as true with my Octopus Teacher, even if it did maybe make them think differently about their relationship with the ocean. I doubt it made them think differently about eating shrimp or, some other kind of seafood other than octopus.
Jennifer, further thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so I think, in that 2007 paper, it was the first paper the one that you mentioned, I was invited to Scripps to give a talk. That was the paper I spoke about. Yeah. At the end of that paper, what Daniel, Polly, and I suggested was what needs to happen for fish is to go through the same revolution that whales went through, which is a decommodification. And I think what you're actually seeing is both of these films speaking to that value system, which is the idea that we have to relate to seafood, not as a commodity, but as animals. And maybe eventually we'll even relate to some of those animals as individuals. And you see that in my Octopus Teacher. They have such a leg up, maybe 8 legs up, because they're dealing with a relationship with an individual. That's a completely different movie than trying to address, the Anthropocene, plastics in the ocean, dolphins, bycatch.
Okay, now we start to get into what this podcast is about, which is narrative structure and the power of the singular narrative. And narrative is at its strongest when it's boiled down to the singular. The power of storytelling rests in the specifics. And you're exactly right. What you're saying is that my Octopus Teacher was a powerful film because it was that singular humanized narrative of the one octopus and those sorts of things. And it did reach a lot of people. And again, I started this whole thing by saying that my buddy at HBO Netflix said there was zero impact of Seaspiracy. I don't care what all the people in their blogs and everything in the ocean conservation world said to each other as they got all wound up over it. It just didn't reach the outer circle pretty much at all. And, you know, and by the time it did reach those sorts of people, it had lost them probably by halfway through the film. Like, what are we on? That's what Jen was talking about. There are so many different little side tracks and things like that. So there was a failure to comply with a lot of these core basic principles, as Jen would know, having done the ABT framework course twice, arc plot and things like that, that are just fundamental rules on how you communicate through film. And these documentary filmmakers don't seem to have any interest in learning these things. And that actually matches up with a couple of weeks ago when we had Jason Ensler here. And I've gotten some interesting emails from that episode of the podcast where I talked to him about visual expression and all these great things that Bruce Block has developed in his teachings in his book. And we're going to have him in a few weeks. And then Jason said, those things are all great, but most of the directors you meet in Hollywood haven't even heard of it. You can't talk to them about that stuff. So it's the sadness of wasted opportunities. There is the potential to make a film that could really be powerful and impactful, I think, but it ain't as simple as just gluing all the facts together. Jen, you want to say anything more about My Octopus Teacher? Because you did have more things to say about how that works.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really struck me, if we're talking about narrative, is this idea that for a long time we believed that people got most immersed in a story because of the plot. But there was some really interesting research that came out a couple of years ago. So functional MRI work, so essentially looking at how people's brains respond to different parts of story. And this paper showed really clearly that actually we identify most strongly with the protagonist in a story and much less with the plot. And I think that really struck me as such a key difference between these two movies, because in Seaspiracy, Ali basically, sets out that ABT that Randy spoke about initially. He says that for him, the ocean was this indestructible source of inspiration. And the but is when he realizes that actually the oceans aren't what he'd seen on all the documentaries, and he'd seen this new side and the human impact. But we don't really find out much more about what's at stake for him other than he's a filmmaker who's connecting with the ocean that he really loves. Whereas it's impossible with My Octopus Teacher with Craig Foster. I just think it's impossible not to connect with him, as a human being, because he tells you this story about his 2 years of hell. He's worn himself out. He can't sleep. His family's suffering. He's made himself sick from pressure. And the phrase he uses is, the great purpose of my life was in pieces. And, to some people, they might go, suck it up, mate. Toughen up. You're a filmmaker. You're earning money doing something you love. Move on. But I don't know, as a parent, when he said I couldn't be a good father to my son because my life had effectively fallen apart, and he doesn't say it, but obviously he's telling you that his mental health has been terrible and he's been suffering terribly, whether it's depression, anxiety, we don't know. And so immediately you are deeply connected to him as a character. And when it turns out that the ocean and one octopus turns out to be his savior, and by the end of the movie, he is parenting his son in the way that he hoped, and he's sharing his deep passion and love for the ocean with his son, and this pride of watching his son being this beautiful, gentle naturalist. I don't know, to me, emotionally, I am so caught up in that. Whereas Ali's story, I also grew up loving the ocean. I went to uni to study marine biology. I loved it, but I don't know, I just didn't feel the same connection to his story, which is a shame, because there is so much in Seaspiracy that's important for us to connect with, but it's hard to do that because you don't know what's at stake in Ali's life.
Yeah. Okay,
how is his life going to fall apart if he doesn't make this movie? Whereas with Craig, he tells you his life fell apart.
That was an excellent analysis. If we can indulge in that 1 or 2 more minutes deeper, and this starts to get into our ABT framework nerd talk, but basically what you're saying is a lot more work was done in the context up front, developing the character, the whole world, everything, what's at stake, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it really conforms with all these basic principles we've been working on. And you take a look at those 5 key elements of arc plot. Whose story was it? Who's the main character? Jen, whose story was this movie? You tell me.
For Seaspiracy?
No, for Octopus Teacher.
Oh, it's Craig's
Yeah.
Craig's story.
Yeah, yeah. Yes,
It's
exactly.
him finding salvation
Yeah.
in the
So-
ocean.
Right. So even though there's this amazing octopus that we get to see start to finish, it's really his story. So we got a clear, was he an active protagonist? Was he doing things to address his problems in the world?
Well, he he says he just fell back on the only thing he knew from his childhood of what he loved doing, which was to be in the water.
Yeah. Was everything, were all the events told in linear order pretty much?
Yeah, pretty much.
It had a whole year cycle of the life of the octopus.
Yep.
Was there complete causality? Everything pretty much all made sense as you went along? Yes, it was. It wasn't just jumped in random things. And then these are the 5 key characteristics of arc plot. And then the last thing, did it have a closed ending? Did it all kind of come together and answer the main questions? Yes, it did with the death of the octopus. Absolutely. So you start to see some of these key principles at work in a film like that did resonate. And I think a lot of it is that context up front. So that's very, very interesting. Let's get back to the overfishing issue. Jennifer, when we first talked about Seaspiracy 2 months ago, one of the things that you had said was that bit about, look, it's just the same old thing that was 20 years ago. These same problems existed. And what's happened? Why is it? And so I was looking last night, Jen and I were talking, we were looking at, found, I think, the FAO website on World Catch. And I was under the impression in 2003 and 4, when we were running shifting baselines, that we'd hit maximum sustainable yield of the oceans and we're about to exceed that and everything's going to come crashing down. It is 17 years later and they're harvesting more. And it's the curve seems to be on a plateau, just increasing a little bit more. Where's the big collapse that was being predicted back then? What happened?
Well, I mean, now we're getting into the science or the reality, and there's a lot to be said there. But fisheries catches have peaked and are declining. And as you know, there is the reason why we haven't seen this ultimate collapse is because of technology that allows us to expand further offshore, deeper, and for new species. And so if you're looking at, very specific populations, you will see that trend. But if you're just looking at global biomass and the numbers of tonnage reported, some of that is masked by new catches for new species. So we don't want to draw too many inferences from the FAO global trends that we see. We think more about fisheries catch globally in terms of catch per unit effort, which has definitely declined over time. And of course, that depends on how you measure effort and all of that. And yeah, I mean, the question, are the oceans empty, completely empty? Of course not. Can they rebound? Yes, they can. Will everything be gone by 2048? The most controversial thing ever said, apparently, about the oceans. No, it probably won't be entirely gone. But do the oceans look drastically different today than they did 50 years ago? And from all of your work underwater that they absolutely do. I know the limited time. John Hocevar knows even these anecdotal data, even personal experiences show you the oceans are in trouble. And I think anything to draw attention to that, even with, again, all of its flaws, is just not a terrible thing in today's age, because as you know, it's hard to get that signal through the noise.
John, want to disagree with all that or not?
No, what she said. That's absolutely right. And, it gets at the challenge of telling people a story, showing them a story that is largely invisible. If you go to the beach, it still looks like the ocean is there. Mm-hmm. If you go to the supermarket or the restaurant, you want seafood, you can still buy seafood. It's not the same seafood that your parents or your grandparents ate, or might be the same species. It's probably farmed instead of wild, things like that. It takes a while for all of these changes to add up to something that's visible, which is different. And you were talking about this earlier, to plastic in a way, but that's a cumulative problem too. We created this massive plastic problem over 70 years, and it wasn't really visible to most people until about 5 years ago. So it's similar in that sense, the incremental nature of it, with punctuated collapses and disasters.
Are we headed towards any kind of a precipice for world total fisheries harvest, or will it continue to just plateau along for another 2 or 3 decades? Because Once again, that was 17 years ago that I put together that pristine slideshow that we used to kick off, actually 18 years ago in January 2008, that began our Shifting Baselines campaign. And that was a really popular little flash slideshow that we had lots of other groups picked it up and used it. And in there, it said by the time today's kids are able to drive cars, there'll be no fishery left in the North Atlantic. Is that true? Is there no fishery left in the North Atlantic?
Okay, well, think about what you know about food webs and what happens when you wipe out apex predators and how you see a rise in prey, right? So you can get, like we have now, massive squid fisheries that really increase that global biomass. We didn't have squid fisheries at this size 40 years ago. We were not catching squids, but if you're just looking at tonnage, you're going to go, well, look, we're still catching things, we're still eating things, right? But those things are different. They're caught further offshore, they're caught deeper. And that allows us, again, to not see some of those problems. So yeah, we are not eating Atlantic cod. We won't be eating Atlantic cod anytime soon. That fishery is gone. But we have lobsters, and they are being basically ranched off the coast, and they are contributing to that biomass. We have their prey, and we're eating those. So I think that's I hate to say it, but overly simplistic way of thinking about the oceans. It's just, well, we're still catching things from the ocean, so it must be fine. We know that food webs are complex and that we are trying to bring back, this resilience and ecological complexity that we once had that doesn't exist in so many parts of the ocean anymore.
Again, maybe I'm devil's advocate or whatever, but it seems to me this campaign to convey to the public there's an overfishing problem has been a complete failure. I don't think the public, and the sustainable seafood cards kind of came and went, and they were a trend back then in 2004 when we started Shifting Baselines. Like everybody's got the cards, and then they just got burned down on them. And I don't know the sustainability issue anymore. And what about aquaculture? I mean, that's what's cranked up the world seafood consumption, right? And that's on that FAO side. It was showing the increase in aquaculture since 1990s, like 500%, gargantuan. Is that a good thing?
Not if you have the value set that I have, but other people who just want to eat food seem to be pretty happy about it. You see this as reality perception communication. I see this a lot in terms of battles, social values. Battles over those values and why people feel certain ways about things and the terms that they use to convey that. So yeah, I agree with you that overfishing doesn't seem to be, on everybody's mind. I think that in part is because we haven't reached really where we have to go in that conversation, which is not about this precisionism, managing fisheries, tinkering around the edges, getting the better science. Like for me, it's about having a new relationship with the animals, with the oceans, and these films are both contributing to that in interesting ways.
Value systems, I would interpret that to some way is kind of like one set of people's value systems includes lots of golf courses in America, and then another group's like, let's get rid of golf courses forever. And you're talking about the same type of thing for the oceans, right? So one group of people says, we're going to go ahead and beat down the oceans this amount so that we can eat lots of seafood. And the other group is saying, let's not do that.
And that group is about 4 people, and we're part of it. So we need more people to, we need that value to take hold a little stronger. But I think that's what we're ultimately working on. And that's where I would argue that this movement failed, and certainly where the Marine Stewardship Council failed, was that it got into tinkering with the science. It got into the numbers. It didn't change the relationship. And I want to see a change in the relationship. And that's what Carl is arguing.
I will say one thing, which is that long ago, 25 to 30 years ago, I was not a fan in the least of Sylvia Earle and events that I took part in that she was a part of, that I feel she botched things at times. Never been a fan of hers. Sorry, no, you're not allowed to say that, but I will say that. But I thought she did great in this film, Seaspiracy. All of a sudden, like, her time has come. Her message of stop eating fish was cockamamie 25 years ago, but now suddenly it's starting to align with the facts. And I think there are probably a lot more people not seeing that as so crazy as it once was. You agree with that?
I agree with that. I mean, I put myself in her shoes where, I'm hoping that in 20 more years, I don't seem crazy either. It's just, that means that the culture is moving in line with your values. And she was a trailblazer. And
Yeah.
now she's sort of square in the middle, but she wasn't Jane Goodall. And that's what we still need. And that's what Craig Foster offers us, is somebody showing us that you can even have relationships with these individual animals.
Yeah, humanizing the whole element. Actually, towards that very point, I read something recently, somebody sent me, that had a whole big section about the whole movement to give animals human rights and try and weave it into. Can you tell us that briefly? What's that movement about?
John, do you want to speak to this, or do you want? Okay.
Oh, is that
Well,
what? Are you in the middle of it, John? Are you a part of that?
Not as much as Jennifer.
Aha. Okay. Yeah. Give us a brief. Give us the ABT of that for starters, Jennifer.
I'm
Yeah.
an ABT.
Spur of the moment.
So we have been treating animals like shit and causing a lot of harm and suffering, but there are various ways to protect animals, and a lot of people would like to see that happen. Therefore, there are giving animals a personhood, I think is what you're referring to, or human rights.
Yeah.
Is one legal avenue for that. There are other various forms of protection as well, such as there's a more conservative view as wildlife as property owners, giving wild animals property rights, which is a sort of Olin Foundation popular, Cato Institute view, if you care about animals. And then there are other ways to protect.
Wait. Cato Institute?
Well, they've just been big into property rights as the ultimate, manifestation of
They're
rights.
so into property rights, they're willing to give them to animals.
So the people who care about animals within the conservative movement like this idea of granting animals property rights.
Is that them getting so far out on their cause that they're circling around to the left and converging on wild
I think
ideas?
it does. There are a lot of conservatives who care about animals, and it's a bipartisan issue. And that's one reason I found Seaspiracy exciting, because it draws in some new advocates who weren't ocean advocates, they weren't conservationists, but they care about animals. They care about dolphins or whatever. And
what were the reasons? What were the reasons why some people did not find that movie exciting?
Seaspiracy?
Yes.
You mean exciting in what way?
Well, I mean, what's the pushback from environmentalists? You must have listened to plenty of that. What got people angry about it?
Well, I think John can speak better to the hoodwinking element of the film.
Can you give us a little of that, John? I mean, number one, just plain accuracy. Was there a lot of scientific inaccuracy? And then number two, was there dishonest distortion? Those two things.
I think on the fishery side, you can quibble over some of the details, but basically he was saying things are really bad and they're really bad. So that was, the bits where they didn't get it quite right were, I'll call them rounding errors. And they're going to upset some people more than others. It's not the way I would like to make a film, but it wasn't my film to make. I think where I got upset with stuff was where they were saying, look, the only really important thing in the ocean to worry about is fisheries. And they cited studies that are dated and regional, and tried to portray those as speaking to the whole issue of marine debris and plastic in the ocean. And, they got that really wrong, and not like a little bit wrong, but really, really wrong.
Yeah.
And
I mean, do you feel they just basically threw that whole issue under the bus as their straw man, their part of their ABT, basically?
Yeah. Once they had this frame, this Seaspiracy frame to tell the story, it led them in a bunch of dumb ways. It led them to attack people that were doing good work. It led them to say that important issues were not important. It pretended that no one was talking about something when actually, there've been a lot of people talking about this stuff for a really long time. There wasn't anything new in the film. So that kind of undermined their story a little bit. But for me, I have to admit that I didn't mind the gotcha moments when I felt like the people deserved it. And I got upset when I felt like it was people that are doing good work. So maybe for me, it was less about the tactic and more about picking on people that didn't deserve it versus the ones that I thought did.
And they really did do that. It was very cheesy the way they caught a few people out, and very hardworking people that I know that didn't deserve that sort of treatment. Hey, Matt, have there been any questions? We got just a few more minutes here before we wrap things up. Anybody?
I'm afraid not. YouTube's been pretty quiet.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Jen, any more final thoughts on the two films?
No, well, not necessarily in the two films, but something that Randy, you and I discussed that came out from our bushfire episode, I feel really applies here because, is it all about the plastic? Is it all about the overfishing? Which of those messages is more likely to land with the public? Which message do we try and push? All of that stuff just made me think of what came out in our bushfire episode a few weeks ago about this idea of misguided confidence that, I don't know, maybe I'm just a nice person, but I tend to want to give people the benefit of the doubt that whether it's Craig, whether it's Ali, whether it's anyone who's involved in this sort of education work, people are doing what they think is the best. Everyone cares deeply about this stuff. And people presumably are making what they feel are well-educated decisions about how am I most going to have impact? How am I most going to get people to listen? And in hindsight, it's very easy, and Randy, it's really easy for you and I to criticize and say, well, they didn't do this very well, or gee, the narrative's not very good, or, it's so easy to criticize. But I think misguided confidence, people think they're doing the best for a cause they care about. And maybe from the outside, we can pick holes, but yeah.
You and I can debate that later. I think the majority of people are doing good work. There's some rotten apples in the system. It's inevitable. But
of course,
that's a whole
without
separate
question.
topic. Yes,
without
okay.
question, but
yeah. No, okay. Yeah. And John, we're going to wrap things up here. You got any final thoughts on this whole issue about the movie or the future of fisheries? Where are we headed to?
Well, I just actually wanted to say one more thing about my Octopus Teacher. I thought it was really provocative and in lots of good ways. And one of the things that stood out for me or made me think about was what we know about the ocean, how we do science in the ocean. And most of what we know, we learned from killing things. We dragged stuff up in nets or on hooks. And, you can learn things from that. And we learned some useful and important things. And that's still a lot of how we study the ocean. And this was a different way to understand what's happening. And it can teach you so much more. And it reminds me of the work that I've been a part of with submersibles or with scuba, the in situ research, where you see things alive and how they're interacting with other things in their natural habitat. And it's the difference between, pulling up something dead and studying a community. Imagine the aliens coming to Earth and dragging a net through New York City and figuring that Earth is made of parking meters and homeless people and taxis, trying to make sense of that. That's what we know of the ocean for the most part. And this was a window into a different way of trying to understand.
Yeah. That's great. How urgent are the issues of overfishing right now? Are they just chronic or acute?
Spectacularly urgent in so many ways. And we've gotten better at not overfishing individual populations, but we still are doing that a lot all over the world. But we've gotten better at it. We've gotten almost no better at all the ecological impacts of the way we fish. We destroy habitats through bottom trawling. We catch 20 times as much of the target species through bycatch. We just lay waste to the oceans with our sustainable single species fisheries. And that.
What's the worst thing coming in the next 5 years if we don't do something drastically different?
We won't see it coming because all these things are piling on top of each other. The plastic pollution, the climate change, the ocean acidification, the fisheries, the hubris and lack of precaution. We won't understand where we went wrong when it happens.
That's an interesting answer. Thank you very much. Cool. Okie dokie. And final thoughts, Dr. Jacquet?
I think I'll end on the note, again, drawing a parallel to whales. We had this industrial whaling system. You could argue, and you can see the overexploitation of whales. These, if you looked at it by species, you would see this peak, let's say in the early 1900s or the late 1800s, some people argue that the signals of the Anthropocene are actually most evident early on in the whaling populations. And then we have this new relationship that unfolds really quickly. The IWC was set up to manage whaling as an industry. It becomes anti-whaling entirely. And that shift happens in unexpected ways. I think that's why the social systems are so interesting. And that could happen for fish, and that could save them. And that's what I'm pushing for, and that decommodification.
So let me just push that a little bit further and kind of super simplify it for my simpleton brain. You're saying the bottom line is to more or less humanize fish as an entity and have us connect with them in some sort of human level that we empathize with them or something like that.
I mean, I guess I don't know that I agree with you using the term humanize, because I'm not sure we see whales as human. I think we see them as sophisticated and interesting in their own way.
Do you think that with my Octopus Teacher, we saw the octopus as anthropomorphized and human?
I mean, I didn't, because maybe I know more about them, but I would say we saw a relationship between a human and an individual octopus, which you're not going to see for every invertebrate, so that's not going to be possible to do.
But this is an age-old struggle in the world of wildlife filmmaking, whether or not to anthropomorphize the creatures. And the more you do it, the more people care about them. Welcome to the real world of the human brain.
Yep.
Don't know.
And
yeah.
I think that's okay. I mean, I think I think whatever, it was an honest story from Craig about his relationship with her. So that matters, it's not, I don't think he overstepped his boundaries.
Interesting.
So as we see more, I think we might expect that to happen with the cuttlefish. We might see my cuttlefish teacher. We might see, my cleaner wrasse teacher.
Will we ever get it down to the level of what I studied for my dissertation, which is sea squirts?
In my perfect world, yes, we will see my sea squirt teacher in 2028. Okay, that's my prediction.
What did he learn from his sea squirt?
Plenty. That's the point, Randy. You learned plenty.
Yes, it's a very meditative creature. It sits there all day doing nothing. All right, and for the final wrap-up word, live from Australia, Jen Martin, give us your final thoughts.
My final thoughts are that I just think that's such an important question. Was the octopus humanized, or did we just get this deep, profound respect for an octopus being really good at being an octopus and all that involves, being able to brood the eggs, being able to, oxygenate them, being able to hide, being able to do all the things that, I didn't, just like Jennifer, I didn't feel like the octopus was being humanized. I just loved the fact that I came away with more knowledge of what an octopus is and how an octopus survives. And I mean, isn't that kind of what the world is about? Trying desperately to see the world through other pairs of eyes that we can't ever do properly. But when you get the slightest hint of it, it's pretty meaningful.
Did you feel something for the octopus when it reached the end of its life?
Oh, how could you not? Absolutely, because you had so much respect for how hard she'd worked to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I mean, maybe somebody could make the same sort of film about a migrating salmon, something like that someday soon, coming to a Netflix theater near you. Excellent. Okay. Thank you guys very, very much. This turned out to be a really interesting discussion. I think it was a great comparison to those two movies. It was a good way to look at Seaspiracy and see what's to be learned from that. And have yourself a wonderful week. And tune back in soon to learn more about the ABT framework. Best of luck to both of you in the world of fisheries, and save the oceans for us, please.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Randy.
Thanks, John and Jennifer. It was wonderful to hear from you.
Yay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next week, Jen. Bye.
Bye.